Good morning. We're conducting interviews this morning for the Save Our Steeples project. This is Friday, November 18th, 2021. I'm going to be interviewing Alice Voytko. Alice, would you please spell your last name for me?
Voytko.
Thank you. So we're going to ask some questions this morning, and we're going to ask you your relationship to the Save Our Steeples project. So let's get started. What was your relationship to the original church that closed?
Interestingly, when I came back to town, I went shopping for churches, and I walked into St. Stephen's and the first thing that caught my eye was the Slovak in the archway that said, "Come kneel before the Lord." And then the recently departed lovely man, John Fetzko, was the lector, and he got up and he never didn't say anything except "Potvalan put Pan Jesus Christus." And I said, "I'm home." My grandmother said that every time she went to a home to visit. And it simply means, again, praise the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. And I thought, this is neat, let me try it. Then I realized what a gorgeous church it is. And I was hooked, I just stayed.
So how did you hear about the closing of the churches when that was announced?
Well, I had gotten very involved in some of the church committees, and it came up somewhere along the line in, I don't remember whether it was Parish Council or another committee meeting. And everybody was saying, what are we going to do? You know, the sky is falling. And so it just became for a while a topic of conversation, with everybody panicking because we didn't know. When I first heard it, we had no idea what church was going to close. And we who were already involved with St. Stephen's were saying, hope it's not my church, as were all the rest of the parishes.
Did your church reach out to the diocese at all to get any clarification if it was going to be your church or not?
They really didn't have to. It came along rather quickly. I mean, to us it was an eternity of concern. Is it going to be us? But there were discussions ongoing after the word was out. I think that it probably had already been predetermined when they made the announcements. I think they knew what was going to happen, generally speaking. But I don't recall any specific aha moment.
Okay. How did you learn or hear about the Save Our Steeples initiative?
You know, I don't remember that. It just came up. I think it was one of the members of the committees that was a West Ender. And I think that I heard it that way. And I said, okay, this sounds like a great idea. Let's save our steeples. Ironically, it turns out that my grandfather bought a house that was catty corner from St. Stephen's, and he worked in the mills. And so St. Stephen's was really our home church for a long time, until we moved up to Brownstown and went to St. Michael's. So it was rather interesting. He would come down, go to Mass, and then walk across the bridge to the mills and go to work. And I didn't know this until after I had been involved with it, that it came out in conversation with some of my older cousins. And evidently, the other half of it was, and after work, he came back and worked on building the new church.
Huh. So talk about your involvement with Save Our Steeples. Like, what did you do in the organization? Any of the activities you participated in? I mean, it was a grassroots movement, so.
I in general, tried just to be as useful as possible. Having come from a not-for-profit organization background, I thought that I could probably do something. And it turned out to be mostly acquisition of resources, making contacts, reaching out, doing that sort of thing. And then in general doing the grunt work when we had projects that were ongoing. It really depended, in the early days it just depended on presence. I mean, they really needed somebody to be physically present at the meetings and in some cases the debates, we'll call them that, so who could step back a little bit and say, wait a minute. And that was part of what I tried to do. You have to be somewhat amorphous in those kinds of beginning setups, because they, as you know, I'm sure more than well, that things can change in a heartbeat. Because all of a sudden you go in one direction and boom, we need to take a turn right, left, or wherever.
So how do you feel about when 1901 Foundation took over the acquisition of the churches?
When I read that question, I had to chuckle because there was such a questioning sensation that went through everybody. What are they going to do? Are they going to help us? And I'm thinking, nobody said that, you know. And as it progressed, the ideas started to gel. And when the Partners for Sacred Places came in, to me that made a huge, huge difference in everything, because their vision was so much wider and more creative than anything that had been said before. And I think that the community meetings that they had and the group activities that they did a lot to get key people involved and pointed in the direction of how do we save them, and not woe is me. In other words, they weren't fighting for their parish alone. They were fighting to make sure that all these beautiful churches would not be desecrated or, as was the case with St. Emmerich's, razed to the ground.
Did you participate in the charettes and all those public events? They had a lot of public meetings. Did you participate in any of
everyone
those?
that I could get to, because I was fascinated with the ideas that were coming out. They were so creative and so interesting. I can remember one architect saying, whatever you do, don't let anybody build any high towers down by sheets. And I'm like, wow. And his reason was you get the most beautiful view of the Gap coming down Chestnut Street. And he said, no multi-story anythings down there. And I thought, I never looked at that. And there was a lot. I had been away for 30-some years. So when I was listening to the charettes and the views, I was like, oh my gosh. When I lived here, I was too young to have appreciated that. And now I saw the whole place with different eyes, and I found it thoroughly enjoyable.
So as a parishioner at St. Stephen's, now St. Stephen's is now Resurrection Parish, so it was one of the churches that was reused by the diocese. How did you feel about that when that announcement was made, that St. Stephen's would be transformed?
I was overjoyed, because I think the church itself is beautiful, and of course I have an emotional and hereditary attachment to it. I later came to realize that there was a lot more work to be done in order to make it more user-friendly. Those steps out front. Boy, there is a challenge to your cardio system, but I think the only question that we had was internal kinds of things. What's going to happen to this and that and the other thing? And of course the diocese came out with a statement that said that they would replace the pastor. And that had us somewhat concerned because we had no idea, and Father Stanko had been such a good Joe, and I forget who preceded him, but there was a very close relationship between the pastors and the congregation that existed when I came into the church.
Now, I understand that there are remnants of the other closed churches that were brought to St. Stephen's when it was made Resurrection. Can you talk about any of that?
Well, we have the statue from Immaculate Conception that was supposed to have survived the flood and wound up untouched back where it was to begin with. We have some of the statuary in the church. We have some of the statuary down at the oratory. There are other things like Christmas ornaments and those kinds of things, to the extent that they could be salvaged, were brought in. For a long time, we had all of this stuff stored at St. Casmir School. And periodically, a gang of us would go down and see if we could sort through, because it was not particularly well organized. I mean, there wasn't a lot of time to get these things out of the churches. The altars were dispersed throughout the world, and the more mobile things were brought into St. Casmir School, and we worked through that, trying to make sure that the identity of the items remained with the original parish.
Okay.
And that was a task.
Mm-hmm.
I remember being in that school one day, and the people who were working with me had gone to St. Casmir's, and they were emotionally just so distraught to see their school being emptied out like that, because the building was up for sale. And it was very, very emotional situation for them.
So speaking of selling things, so they did sell St. Casmir to Stella Property Management.
Yep.
So it is now in the hands of a for-profit versus a non-profit, because 1901 is a non-profit, and they still have Immaculate Conception, which is now the Grand Hall, and St. Columba.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you feel about St. Casmir and what's happening over at the Casmir Cultural Center?
I think it's a brilliant idea. I mean, profit, not for profit, that's something that can be debated pro and con. But what I have focused on is how quickly Stella Properties got the impetus to start moving things, and from the beginning, Chad and Stephen both said they planned to honor the history of the church, and in the way they have their events and such. And I've seen nothing but improvement. It's been done beautifully. Sorry. But great, good for them. I hope they can continue it. Turning this into a cultural area was something that Partners for Sacred Places wanted to do from the beginning. So, go for it.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about any feelings you had about any of the history of these churches, from the time when you were a parishioner through the sale, through the reuse of them to this day? Anything else you'd like to share? Any thoughts or feelings?
I had a kind of a say what moment when they decided to keep the oratory, move the rectory, and sell the school that was St. Stephen's. My logic said, what are you talking about? This, the plumbing's bad. It's Cambria City. If you have a house down here that doesn't have a plumbing problem, you're really lucky. Seriously. I mean, at it as a homeowner, I'm thinking, you gotta be kidding me, the place was gorgeous. And I never understood that we didn't keep that block because I didn't think that it was going to be that difficult to convert that school into whatever purposes down the street was. It kind of made me think, my immediate reaction was politics. It had to be some kind of politics because I couldn't see any reason for it. I am pretty much a traditionalist insofar as every place I've gone, the rectory was always next door to the church. Why do I care about that? I don't know. It's the way it's always been with me. And I saw, because I had worked at St. Stephen's, we peeled potatoes for pierogi and all that kind of stuff. So I knew the school and its kitchen and all that sort of thing. So what's wrong with this? And the answer was nothing that I could come up with. And having somewhat of a distance, I thought I was being as objective as I could be about it. But it didn't make sense because we could have had a whole different configuration of that block, and would it have been more convenient? Who knows?
Right.
But that was the one thing that I will always remember when I think about that consolidation. And there was a lot said about, initially, a lot said about the accessibility at Immaculate Conception, since there are literally no steps to speak of there. And people were concerned about that. Well, a hip replacement and a knee replacement later, I have a lot of sympathy for the people who have to crawl up the steps at St. Stephen's, and I was real happy to see the lift.
How would you have felt had St. Stephen's not been the church selected for reuse?
Totally devastated. I don't know where I might have gone instead, since I felt such an emotional attachment, and had that not been selected. That's a very good question.
Now, when the diocese came in and tried to, I don't want to say neutralize, but change it from everyone referring it to St. Stephen's, when they renamed it Resurrection Parish, did they change anything inside the church or remove any of that? I know they changed that arch you talked about, that Slovak saying.
Yeah, and I've heard numerous stories about that. Oh, you can't have that up there. It does. Well, what language would you like, dear? You know. They added some of the statuary from the other churches. But overall, it didn't make huge changes that hadn't already begun to occur with Vatican II. But I didn't see any astronomically different things happening.
Did parishioners from the other churches that had closed, did they become parishioners at Resurrection then?
Many have. There were some people who went elsewhere. It's your choice. It's your religion. You've got to do what you do.
Do you think the hard feelings over the closing of the churches has subsided now? It's been quite some time. They closed in 2009.
Yes, I think that has quieted down. I also think that there will always be sore spots with some people, but the attendance at the masses has been good considering COVID. Now people are coming back. Father George has made a super impact on just the overall attitude toward it. It's resurrection period, end of statement.
So back, just one last thing with Save Our Steeples. It was through the actions of Save Our Steeples that they were able to get 1901 in and get the diocese to hand over the churches. Do you think if Save Our Steeples hadn't done what they did, what do you think would have become of those churches if just left into the hands of the diocese?
I think that would have been extremely tricky. That, as is the case with so many organizations, the diocesan headquarters would not have been sufficient, to my thinking, sufficiently attuned or sensitive to the people and how they felt. I could hear it immediately just by sitting and listening to the people. You know, I was baptized here, I was confirmed here, I was married here, my kids. So losing a church would have been just awful for all of them. I think that the diocese structure did what they thought was best, given what was left to them, because it was not Bishop Mark's decision. This was Bishop Adamek's decision to do this. And his statement was that he didn't want somebody else to have to deal with it. Well, I'm afraid that was not well thought out, because he wasn't considering what the emotional status of the people would be over such a huge move.
Do you think the buildings would still be standing today if the diocese was not unable to give them to another organization?
I can't imagine how they could have pulled it off to have done something. I think that one of the things that kept popping up in all of the discussions was the church in Pittsburgh, where they took out the altar and they had the brewery installed there. Well, I know people who've gone there, including priests, who say it's a great restaurant. And I know people who go, it should be the altar there.
But do you think they would have been happier to see them end up like St. Emmerich? Because St. Emmerich was raised.
Oh no, that is a very sore spot. That, from what I could observe, that was very sore. They did not want to see those buildings go down, and these buildings go down. And I think this is one of the things that contributed to their, albeit gradual, acceptance of the situation, because a lot of people this is an old town. And we have old parishioners. A lot of people remember St. Emmerich's and the devastation they felt when that church came down. They were not pleased at all. And so I think the fear of that happening was in great part a motivator to get together and let's get the show on the road and put our petty grievances aside. It is what it is. You can't keep looking backward. You've got to go forward. And I don't think that the diocese could have done anything one way or the other except listen carefully to what people are saying. And it's the typical organizational structure problem of being in tune. And unless you've got boots on the ground here, you're not in tune. You've got to be in a situation where people will talk to you clearly and simply and to tell you the stories. And like the people who were so concerned about the St. Casmir school, and are still concerned, quite frankly. It kills them to see that this school may just collapse on them. That's very great concern. And I haven't heard anything about any movement in any direction on that. But we tend to, in this town, to like to keep our history.
Understandable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And when you have an interesting history like we have, with all the little stories, I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to say, but this is still in place, or but this went to a needy church in Guatemala.
Right.
That helps a lot.
Right.
it also woke up a few people about their storage of records, which
Right.
is really difficult, because there are still records that can't be opened because they got wet, they were stored badly.
Yeah.
That could be tough.
So, anything else? If not, I'd certainly like to thank you for your time today and your perspective on this, especially having been a parishioner of one of the churches that was on the list to be closed but was salvaged and recommissioned as a new parish. So you have some really interesting experiences with this.
It was quite an interesting journey. Although I wouldn't trade it for anything because of what I learned about the town and myself and what I could do and what I couldn't do and so on. So I would not have forgone that experience. I always have been a crusader, or no matter what, I'm out there trying to wave the old flag and get things, let's get this moving, we can do this. It's I don't know, it's in my nature or something. Give it a shot, see what happens.
Well, thank you very much.